So we're going to be talking about supporting old-fashioned AngularJS apps in a modern TypeScript world today. But before we get started, conferences are always interesting because you're learning a lot of new stuff, and sometimes that can make you feel bad about yourself because you don't know everything already. So a little inspiration for everybody today. Whoever needs to hear this, the concept you're currently struggling to learn, stick with it because it's all going to start to make sense very soon. So that's my little motivation for you to get through the conference with everything you want to learn and figure out. You will get there. A little bit about me. My name is Jennifer Wadella. You can follow me on Twitter if you want at OMG It's Fetty. I'm a JavaScript developer at Bitovi, which is a consulting company. Is that like weird echoiness? Okay. I was like, where is that coming from? Okay. God, is that you? And I jokingly call myself a legacy code sympathizer because while Angular 9 is out, we are going to be talking about AngularJS for this conversation. Thank you. That reverb is weird. I'm also a community organizer, and I love brewing kombucha. If you have not tried it, I will talk to you all day about how much I love kombucha. So how many of you today are supporting AngularJS applications? Okay, fair few. I know, it's like, and I give this talk, and sometimes people are like, and I'm like, no, this is a shame-free room. For the next 45 minutes, there is no shame for anything you raise your hand for. And so you might have this problem where you're supporting an AngularJS application, and you're going to upgrade it someday, right? So what do you do as a developer where you're like, okay, I know I'm writing this code, but then I'm going to have to change everything and rewrite everything, and it can be really frustrating. And you're kind of like, okay, how do we build features that we need right now, but that we know we're eventually going to have to port? Like, am I doing duplicate work for myself? How do I deal with that? And mostly importantly, because we're JavaScript developers, and this is all we think about, is how do I keep my skills updated as a developer? Because heaven forbid something happened and you need to go find a new job, and you don't have production Angular experience, and they're like, oh, we won't hire you. And you're like, motherfucker, I've been writing JavaScript for 10 years, but I don't know the latest framework. My bad. But this is an actual concern that we have as developers, is keeping our skill sets up to date. And sometimes we just like to play with the new shiny stuff, right? And so that's kind of what we're going to be talking about throughout this presentation, or how do we deal with all these different things in a really pragmatic way. You might also fall in this category where you just got an AngularJS application dropped in your lap. Maybe your company acquired another project or something like that, and you're like, oh my God, what am I doing? How do I support this? Especially if you've been writing more modern code and figuring out what to do there. I actually had a client who had this situation happen, and he's like, okay, I've never done Angular in my life. I'm trying to figure out, and I can't even Google for relevant AngularJS information because I don't know where in that timeline all this information falls because he wasn't there as it grew. And so it's like, how do you even begin to understand what's going on when everything we're talking about is modern tooling based? So this talk is aimed at some content around there as well. So good news is you can actually take advantage of a lot of modern techniques today. So overarching goals for this talk, I want to give you a roadmap of how you could approach modernizing an AngularJS app and using some new tools. I want to give you a crash course on some modern concepts you may have tuned out on previously. I know I'm really bad at this personally. If something isn't relevant to me at the moment, especially at a conference, I'm just like, la, 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 what's on Twitter? And so again, shame-free room. So if these are things you've tuned out on before, we'll kind of do a crash course so you know what's going on. I want to give you resources to help advocate for modernizing your app. Yes, a big part of our job is writing codes, but another big part is advocating for what we want to do and the technologies we want to use. And so I want to make sure that you're prepared. If you like some of the ideas in this presentation, you can walk in and say, hey, I think we should use this approach. This is why I think this would be productive, and be good to go there. And then give you an example repository with some common scenarios to refer to. I'm that kind of person that I like to jump into code base and get my hands dirty and see how things work. And so I just got this kind of running repo where I just dump different stuff as I play around with content for this talk that you can go in and use as a roadmap for anything you might need. Okay, so starting off with our roadmap, we are going to, first of all, explore modularizing our app. If you even look at AngularJS documentation for how they get started, you have this index.html file, and then you just slap every damn piece of code you write in a different script tag. And we've progressed a little bit since then as humans and developers. And so I've seen situations where people are still managing an app like this. And so how do you begin to take that monstrosity into a more modernized, modularized app? How many M words can I use at once? Going to talk about updating or creating a build process to compile TypeScript files. So a big part of this move is we're going to talk about how to use TypeScript effectively. And so depending on the state of your app, maybe you have a build process, maybe you don't. And so what are some different approaches you can take for both those scenarios? We're going to talk about how to start to convert core app structure files to TypeScript. Cool thing about TypeScript is you can basically rename all your JavaScript files .ts, and they're going to compile to plain JavaScript, right? So you can do it piece by piece. It's not an all or nothing everything at once. So we'll talk about starting with some of the core pieces of your application, converting those to TypeScript, and moving on your Mary type checked way. We'll talk about taking advantage of RxJS where it makes sense, okay? RxJS is a great, shiny toy. You do not need to hit everything with it. But it is really powerful for some great scenarios, and so we'll talk through a couple of those situations. And then we'll also look at building new features using Angular elements, which are a fancy wrapper for web components. I'm not going to debate whether you think web components are good or not. I really don't care. This is a pragmatic approach. I am not that person who's going to go down that rabbit hole. Okay, so is anybody familiar with the AngularJS style guide? Okay, good. Again, dealing with a lot of client code, a lot of people have never heard of the style guide before, and I'm like, oh my gosh, because I remember like being an AngularJS developer and writing like awful, awful code, and then John Papa gave onto us his style guide, and the world was good. But really, it's a fantastic just piece of documentation. If the Wi-Fi isn't tanking, I will pull it up so we can kind of scroll through here. So really highlights a lot of different scenarios and has really good examples of the way you would formally see AngularJS written and a better pattern to move through. So we can kind of look through, and he talks a lot about good ways to name applications, ways to deal with functions. Like a lot of times you saw code like, can you see that? Okay. You would see something like this where you'd have some sort of controller or something, you'd slap an anonymous function in there. So really great conventions around naming our functions appropriately and having good patterns there, which really come into play when we start taking a more modular approach to our application code. So fantastic style guide. Love it, love it, love it. So I always want to put that on people's radar if they were not familiar with it. Key concepts in the style guide, because it's very robust, it's awesome, but I want to highlight a couple things. A big thing here is practicing single responsibility, so making sure that our controllers do one thing, our factories do one thing, and we're not just like having these really bloated files full of code that's just a mess for version control and readability and everything. Using name functions really big deal to make sure that we can quickly parse and understand what's going on in our code. And then using the VM syntax for controller view instead of just dumping everything on $scope. $, scope, y'all. So kind of key concepts there. So my recommendation for that part is look through the style guide and start to take a look at your application. Start with your high-level modules. Take a look at that and start implementing the practices described in the style guide. And that is going to get you a bulk of the way there with having a more modern, maintainable AngularJS application. Okay, so the next thing to do is we want to start using TypeScript. We need to be able to compile our TypeScript files in a way that doesn't make us hate our life. So obviously you could just run like install TypeScript and run TSC and then whatever your file name is that you want to compile, but that's not very practical when we're managing a bunch of different files. So what makes sense is to have it in some sort of build system. Three big players are Grunt, Gulp, and Webpack that I'm going to be talking about today. And I like to call these out because they kind of came into the ecosystem at different times. And whatever you're using is a fine choice. You do not need to reinvent the damn wheel because Webpack is awesome. So just want to put that out there. So if you are using Grunt right now, pretty easy to go ahead and get TypeScript installed for that and create a task for compiling your TypeScript files. So you can do an npm install for Grunt TypeScript, make sure that you're installing TypeScript itself and saving that. And then your Grunt file might look something like this. And here is how you would have your TypeScript compilation set up. So we'll look at this in my code base in a little bit, but when you start to modularize your app, you're going to have one point of entry, one source of truth. A lot of times I will have like a main TS file because I feel like that's a very clear indicator, somebody new to a code base, to go in and look and see where to start, and that's where I'll import my app module, and so that's the file that I start compiling, and so that's what I worry about. The destination is wherever you want that file to be output, if you're serving to some sort of public directory or something like that. And then if there are any additional options or a TypeScript linting that you want to do. So that's kind of what that config would look like. So this is a completely viable solution if you're using Grunt. If you want to start using TypeScript and compiling them, you can get that into your process. So gulp is another one. A buddy of mine, like, man, he made us rewrite so many damn projects once he discovered gulp, and he's like, we have to use gulp for everything now. And granted, it was a lot faster than what we had been doing, so it's kind of great, but I give him crap about that to this day. So another task runner, again, we have a TypeScript plugin that we can install for this to get going. And then you might have a sample task set up where you're going to, depending on what your task line looks like, have one just for compiling your TypeScript files. So again, we're going to start with that one main source of truth where we have most of our application code. Going to compile that, output it wherever we want. All right, and finally we have Webpack, and I do like Webpack a lot. It's my tool of choice, especially because the documentation has gotten way better since the last time I tried to implement Webpack on an AngularJS project and spent like 3 days crying and cursing and messing with config options. This is why I'm not a DevOps person. But really, really great. Modern Angular is also built on Webpack. Most of the time you don't end up messing with it because Angular has done such a good job wrapping it that you never have an issue with it. But it is there, and that is the technology underneath. So if you're taking an approach where you're like, okay, I want to be a little bit more aware, and you do need to implement some sort of build process because you don't have one, Webpack would be my recommendation for that scenario. So again, we're going to have our point of entry, wherever that's going to be. And then we are going to have wherever we want to output that to. And one of the cool things is Webpack has really nice functionality built in for hashing. So when you get that kind of name that's created and prepended to whatever your file is to help avoid caching issues. So kind of cool there. This is what my setup looks like if I come into an AngularJS project that doesn't have any sort of build support setup. This is my file that you're free to copy and mess with. I like running a server that's going to serve all my files locally for most of my projects. And then one of the other really cool things that we have here is the HTML Webpack plugin. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to take our index.html file and use all the contents in there. So if we have any like meta tag information or anything like that we care about preserving, it'll take that and then it will basically inject this bundled file that we've created into that. And so it's just one less thing that you have to worry about in your process. It's really, really nice. We've got a couple rules. We need our HTML loader for that to work. We need our TypeScript loader for Webpack to compile our TypeScript files. So basic configuration there. So the big things we care about with Webpack are the ability to compile our files. So if you're going in and starting to take this approach, that's step number one that we need. Making sure that we're injecting those compiled files into wherever we're going to use them, typically in the index.html file. You might want to be serving your compiled files, which is what I prefer to do. And it's just interesting, too, because I spend most of my time in modern Angular, and you don't even think about this anymore, and then you go into an AngularJS project, and you're like, oh, how far we have come. So that's what we're looking at there. A couple nice to have things. We do have options for bundling, and so if you were doing lazy loading with your application where you're not loading certain parts of the application until you need them, that support is there inside of Webpack. You can also have really great setups for development versus test versus production code. And so having basically something that runs for your local dev environment, but then sourcing your production code, which is minified and everything like that. And then also having your test code compiled when you need to be running your tests. Okay, so let's look at converting our core app structure files to TypeScript. Is anybody familiar with TypeScript? Like, super familiar? No? Okay, shame-free, shame-free. All right, so we'll do a quick crash course, and maybe the people that are familiar will learn something that you weren't aware of before. But we'll talk about what types are, what classes are, what interfaces are, what generics are. And then one of the really great things we get from TypeScript is we get a lot of ES6 goodness that you may not have been able to use or write before. And some of these things can be awkward and hard to Google for. Like, there's no good way to like see generics written in TypeScript and like figure out a way to Google because you're like, what, like caret brackets? Yeah, awkward. Okay, so we have types, and so when we declare a variable, we essentially want to tell what type that should be, because we've all been there where we've tried to call a method on a string that's meant for a number, and then there's drama, and then you've got errors in your browser. So great thing about TypeScript is this will catch those kind of errors or things that we might do in our compilation process. So we're going to get outputted errors immediately instead of having to wait to see something in the browser and realize I did a boo-boo. So we've got our Boolean, we've got number, we've got string, and then these are two different syntaxes for how you can declare arrays. So the first one, that is going to be an array, and it's expecting it to be an array of numbers. The second one, same thing, array. In this case, that's technically a generic that we're using right there, which I'll talk about shortly. Expecting a number as well to be passed in that array. So if I have an array and maybe I try and push a string to it, I'm going to get a TypeScript error because it's like, hey, well, that's not a number. What are you doing? You're crazy. We also have classes. I like to talk about this because modern Angular is very, very class-based. And so as we talk about updating our AngularJS applications, classes can be a new concept, especially if you're somebody like me, who I was a front-end like web designer, and my introduction to application development was like writing way too many jQuery slider plugins because I worked in a marketing agency. And so I didn't come from an object-oriented background or some other language. I started with HTML, I started with CSS, and then I started writing JavaScript, and then I was like, this is cool, I'm gonna hang out here. So classes were a new concept for me. If they're a new concept for you, totally cool. When I talk about converting an AngularJS application, we can begin to use a class structure to declare our components and do all sorts of stuff like that. It gives us a lot of power in the way we write code, but it's also just good for you to add to your skill set and your tool belt and your understanding as a developer. So here we have a basic class where we're declaring a greeting member on here. And then we have a constructor, and so this is going to take a parameter that's going to set that member on the class for us to be able to use. So we call new greeter, we're going to pass in world, and then when I call my greet function, it will return hello plus whatever that member is that I've instantiated this with. So basic class syntax there. I like to call this out because you will see this a lot in modern Angular development. There's a shorthand that we use quite a bit inside of our constructor, and when we declare that member with either public or private, it'll automatically do the assignment that we see here, this.greeting equals message. It's automatically going to take care of that, and TypeScript is just going to say, okay, we know that you're wanting to declare this as a member on the class. So you'll see this kind of shorthand a lot, so it's good to be aware of. I get questions about it in training, so I like to call it out and make sure everybody's aware and on the same page. Cool. So that's what a class looks like with a member and with a method. We also have interfaces, and these are like my favorite thing in the world, especially because I deal with a lot of legacy code. I deal with a lot of like dumpster fire code, and you walk in and nothing's documented because we're developers and we hate documenting. But TypeScript interfaces help you document. So an interface is essentially a contract. It's telling you what something should be like. So in this case, I have a function called quote function, and it's going to take a parameter. And here I'm declaring that it should be a type of this iQueen interface. And so that means it's expecting an object to be passed in that's going to have a name property and a quote property. So if I was trying to execute this function and Queen did not have a name or a quote property on it, that's something I would normally like see in the browser where I'm like, oh crap, what did I do? TypeScript is going to catch this right out the gate. And so you're going to get, you'll see an error if you try and compile this code if you try and call this function with a parameter that does not match this interface. So cool there. By the way, the sample code repo is built on the Drag Race API from RuPaul's Drag Race. So like if you're like, Jennifer, what? Like, I don't understand your code snippets. Like, it's a drag queen application, so good times. Yes. All right, and then we have generics. So generics are a way to really write more maintainable code. So the point of TypeScript is so we can declare types and understand what that type should be. But if we have a function and we're like, okay, I want you to use a parameter of this type, well, what if I want to use that same function with a different type? Okay, like I don't want to have to rewrite that function again. All I care about is passing in the different type. So what we can use are generics, and generics are going to say, hey, I am expecting you to tell me what type you want to use when you're using this function. So in this instance, I've got this getQueens function. I'm going to be hitting an endpoint, and I want to return some sort of response. And I want to know what that response is going to look like. So here's a use of generic where this is expecting an array of my queen interface that I've written, so what a queen should look like, and all the properties, and if there are methods on it, what that should look like. And so I can use this over and over and over again. So here I'm describing that. Here I'm expecting some sort of error, and so I can use that same piece of code over and over and over again with different types. Yay, maintainability. Okay. And then the last part of our crash course in TypeScript is ES6 fun. So a couple things that you may not have come across before are template literals. Wow, words are hard. So instead of concatenating like you might be used to, where you've got a string and you want a variable in there and you do your plus and then you forget a tick mark and then there's drama, we can just use these backticks. And then the syntax for declaring a variable inside of that is using the dollar sign and then inside of curly braces. And so this is going to return whatever that queen said and then whatever the quote is. So template literals are great for use like that. So they save keystrokes, which makes me happy. We also have fat arrow functions. And the big thing about those is not only do you not have to write functions, so yay, saving keystrokes, but they capture the scope of this in the way that you would want it to. So if you look at this code, we've got a set timeout here, and we've got a function. The problem is we're losing the scope of this inside of here. And so that's going to log undefined instead of Bianca like we would expect. So when we use the fat arrow function, which is this syntax, that's going to encapsulate this that we want to make sure that we are able to call our functions in the way we'd expect. So those are probably like of the ES6 stuff, those are the two things that I use the most, I feel, in TypeScript that you may not be aware of if you're new to TypeScript. Okay, so let's get back to talking about our AngularJS app conversion. Let me actually pull up my repo, because I totally forgot that it would be helpful to have code to look at. Oh my god, everything's so tiny. Somewhere, yeah. I would have to tell us 20 times before. Yeah, how did you just do that? Wait, what? Keep going. Oh. You actually know where things are. I know, I was like, I'm pretty good at remembering, but also like I switch between this laptop and my other laptop, and then like I organize them different, and I'm, yeah, dumpster fire. I think that's my current one, yeah. I have so many different like repos that I play around with. Okay, so let's take a look at this. We have something to refer to. Bloop, 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 bloop. It's so tiny. What is that rainbow thing other than under the tab come from? What? This is Synthwave 84. It's a VS Code theme. You know the thing under the tab? Yeah. VS Synthwave 84, if you like this theme. Okay. ADD out. Oh, man. All right. Oh, my God, I have so many windows. Sorry. I'm like in the middle of a dumpster fire client thing at work. Okay. So let's look at what this app looks like. And so this is something that I have taken and like I basically started writing just an AngularJS app according to AngularJS documentation and then started implementing some of these practices into it. So here I've got my index.ts file or main.ts, whatever you want to call it, where I'm importing my main app module. And in here I am importing a couple different things. I've got UI router and I've got all my factories and components that I've written. And let's run this. Oh, how are we doing on time? Oh, we're fine. That was That was fast. Okay. Yes. All right. So we'll get that up and running. But while that works, the first thing to really help you get started with using TypeScript and writing more modern Angular effectively, or we can install Angular types. And so these are going to give us like types and interfaces that we can use to begin to type check our code in a way that it should be written in a more modern approach. So we can install our types. Did somebody say question? Did I imagine that? Oh, okay. Thank you. Where am I serving this at? 8080, okay. Yeah, but I just never remember what's on what. Because modern Angular defaults to 4200, and so I was like, oh, what do I have this set to? Okay, so here's my queen application where basically I want to be able to search for queens and have some syntax binding and see quotes and stuff like that. So here I can see all my queens. If I want to see just queens from one season, if this doesn't like motivate you to watch Drag Race, I don't know what else will. Okay, so that's the application just for context here. What? Yep, good times. Okay. Back to what's at hand. All right, so we've got our app, and that's what's going on. Let's just go back here. Okay, so installing Angular types will allow us to use interfaces to type check different things and make sure we're doing that properly. The other thing we're going to care about doing is being able to write HTML templates in a separate HTML file and then import those for use in our application. So what we need to do for this is create a TypeScript declaration file, which is going to say, okay, if this has the extension .html, we're going to assume that this is something that we can import into our module. So if we look at an example, where is my code? Okay. So if we look at my home component that I have written here, what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to declare whatever my template should be, and I want to be able to import it from an HTML file. And so that's something that's not going to be available out of the box with TypeScript that you'll need to do to take this approach to writing an Angular component. Because what we care about is we care about having a template, we care about having a controller where we're going to be doing a lot of our logic and then binding that to our template. So that's what that is going to look like. So we have an example set up here of what you might have seen before, where we have our main module. We're declaring a component, and we have some templating language in here where we've got an array of queens that we want to iterate through and display whatever that queen is and whatever her vastly inappropriate quote is. So this is what that would look like. I've got my controller here. I've got a queens property set on there, and I'm iterating through that. So this is what code that you might be familiar with kind of out of the box writing AngularJS. What we want to move to is something like this, where we have a function for our controller. We're going to be injecting whatever service that we want to use. And then we want to basically bind everything to this VM variable instead of putting everything on $scope. And then we use our controller as syntax to say VM. And so then as we're in our controller iterating, it would help if I had an appropriate file to look at. We're binding to that to get all of the different whatever we've declared on that controller. VM standing for view model, so that's a good syntax approach to take. So basically, what I hope you can take from this is you start looking at old AngularJS code that you've written and however that may be done, and then start to be able to take this approach where you're refactoring into breaking out your functions using the view model controller as syntax, and kind of creating more readable code here. One of the really important things that again, depending on the state of your AngularJS application, is you want to start to abstract everything out into different files so it's a lot more maintainable. So if you have a controller that's responsible for like some view, a view in the DOM, having that in its single file to do versus like having all your components relevant to maybe one feature inside of your application in the same file. So starting to split those out will be really, really helpful. Okay, so if we're looking at an example module and what that should look like, I'm instantiating my main module here, and then I have my queens component, which is going to display my list of drag queens, and so I'm just going to import the queen component from that file where I've exported that here. And use that instead of having all of that application code in this one file just dumped inside where our Angular module is declared. So this is a really good starting point to get to for refactoring your application. This will make things a lot cleaner, a lot more manageable once you begin to take this approach. You can go one step further as you feel more comfortable with this and take this very class-based approach. So this is where using the Angular types that we installed are going to come into play. And we can start to build really great code with this. So especially if we maybe have some sort of feature that we have a list view and we know that we use that a lot, we might have written some of that base code inside of controller class and maybe we want to implement that or use that somewhere else throughout our application. We can begin to take advantage of those more object-oriented techniques. So if I were to refactor this Angular function into a class, it would look something like this. I know I want this to be a component controller, so I'm saying implements Angular iComponent controller. That is an interface. And I just realized this when we were talking about TypeScript. The important thing to know about interfaces is if you're implementing one, you need to make sure that you're declaring everything inside that interface. So if your interface has a member of queens, if you try and do this controller without implementing that queens member, it's not going to compile because it's saying, hey, you told me you want this to be on there. Okay, so that can give us some type checking for everything we need. This is going to give us a couple different things. In modern Angular, we have this OnInit function, and this function runs basically when the component is loaded into the DOM and it's ready to start executing. And so a lot of times this is when we're going to start want to start running a lot of our code. So maybe if we're doing some sort of fetch to get information based on a route parameter or something like that, that's typically where we'd want that to happen. So we have this function that we can do in that, and it'll behave as modern Angular in the way we would expect as we refactor to this class. We're able to use the constructor to inject any services that we might need to use. So in this is kind of like half refactored, so I know that I want my queen service, which has all my methods for interacting with the drag race API to get back a list of queens or whatever. So I can inject that and call methods on it and all sorts of stuff. Except that is a typo because there should be this in front of it. Okay, so that's just my controller class for handling all of the functionality. The next thing I need to do is actually write my component class. And so a component is something that has a controller, that has a template, and it's representing kind of a piece of information that you want to be using inside the app. So here's where I'm going to bind my controller. I'm going to use my controller as syntax. So this is basically saying, okay, we're expecting that to be a string. We're expecting template to be a string because I am just importing some HTML up at the top here. And so here's all my component code. And so all I'm going to be exporting from this file is that component that contains all this information. And that's what will be used in my app module. Cool. Okay, so that covers starting to refactor our application into a more modularized approach where we're using classes, we're using named functions, everything like that. So the next piece of this is if you want to use something like RxJS where it makes sense. The biggest places I think RxJS is good to start using are managing forms. We're dealing with a lot of different events and input from the user, and sometimes that might relate to information that we want to pull from an endpoint or something like that. So RxJS can really help manage some of that. Services are another great thing where we can get rid of kind of taking a promise-based approach and use observables again, and occasionally routing. Okay, so how many RxJSers are there in here? Okay, got a couple. Everybody else, again, this is shame-free zone, so you are completely fine. So let's do a quick reactive programming crash course. So RxJS is a reactive programming library that helps us take this approach. So you need to understand we've got two types of programming. We've got declarative and we've got imperative. Well, we have more than that, but that's what's relevant for right now. So imperative programming is when an event occurs, code runs, and it's going to change the state of the program. And this is very typical that I feel like a lot of us start off with. A user clicks something on the website, and then we run a piece of code, right? And then maybe that is updating something, and something happens. So it's, fine approach, but it can be really hard to trace what are going on when we begin to modify the state of an application. It can be really, really messy. Versus if we take it a declarative approach, we're specifying how values or how states should be generated. And so we basically are starting with this one source of truth that's like, this is the state of my application. This state can be derived from like this happening or this happening or this happening. And so we have this one starting point that we can look at and figure out what's going on, instead of this happened and this happened, but then this had weird effects and this had weird effects over there. So that's why it's a really great approach. So reactive is this declarative programming style that's concerned with data streams and propagation of change, two things that we care about a lot as front-end developers. We're dealing with ways users are interacting with our application, and then also data or state or anything that we're serving back to that user to help. Okay, so we have observables, which are a lazy push collection of multiple values over time. This is like the core thing that you need to understand with RxJS and reactive programming. So an observable is basically something that is going to have different information that you're getting over time. And the important thing to know is if you want that information, you have to create a subscription to that observable. It's kind of like signing up for a newsletter. That newsletter is going to be putting out information, but you personally aren't going to get that information until you subscribe to that newsletter, and then you will start getting the content from that. So you can think of observables like that. The great thing about observables are they kind of allow us to manage that stream. So if we think about a user typing into an input, and maybe you want to implement a type ahead, right? And so that means every keystroke or every key press, you want to get whatever that character is to start building out your results for a type ahead. So representing that as a value over time that changes are ways that we can listen and get that information. Subjects are special types of observables that can be multicast to many observers. We can publish and subscribe to these, and so I use these a lot when I'm managing state in an application where I want to kind of control what that state looks like based on user input or based on interacting with an API. Behavior subjects are similar to subjects, but the important thing is they will re-emit the last emitted value or a default value it's set. And why we care about this is, again, when you subscribe to an observable, you're only going to get that information after you subscribe. And so if you subscribe to something after it's already had an event or something like that, you're not going to get anything until something else happens. So a lot of times we will actually want the last emitted value at whatever point that we create our subscription. Okay, we have operators. These are our methods to call on our observables to transform them and return them into a new observable. If you're familiar with Lodash or doing any manipulation like that, you can think of it a little bit like that, except more awkward and complicated. The biggest operators that I use are map, which is basically going to take the values from an observable that's been emitted and allow me to do something with them. Merging, we've got all sorts of different functions where we can merge streams of observables and do something with them. And then tap is your best friend. This is how you can console log to understand what the fuck is happening inside of your observable, because when you first start dealing with them, it's a very abstract concept, and I'm a very visual person, so tap allows you to basically peek in, see what's going on with the observable without creating a new subscription. Okay, we are almost out of time. I am like babbling like a crazy person. Okay, one of the best things about modern Angular is the async pipe. And so basically as we're dealing with observables, what this does is it allows us to create a subscription in our template. So I know I want to fetch a list of drag queens, and I know I want to display them in the DOM. If I use the async pipe, that's going to create a subscription. So whenever that request completes, it's going to create that subscription. But when the component gets torn down, it's also going to unsubscribe, so I don't have to worry about cleaning up my messes and dealing with memory leaks. So somebody has actually written an async pipe for AngularJS, which I found, and I was like, oh my gosh, this person deserves all the cookies in the world. So you can start using that, npm install Angular 1 async filter, and so you can use the pipe just like this, where we are saying, hey, create this subscription to this thing that I know is going to be an observable, and then you are able to do anything that you want with that. we'll blow through some of this, operators. Okay, so the last thing I want to cover very, very quickly after we've talked about TypeScript and RxJS and build processes and how to do that is if you are looking at this and you're like, I don't want to keep writing like just AngularJS code, or maybe you have like some sort of conglomerate app where you've got some AngularJS, you've got modern Angular, and you want like ways to use components between those. Angular elements are a plausible approach that you can take for now. So they are essentially just wrapping web components to be used inside of the Angular framework. And web components are just built on a couple different browser APIs. We've got custom elements that's going to allow you to define the HTML tags, so whatever you want to name, like app-queens or whatever. Templates, we can dynamically insert markup that we've created. We've got the shadow DOM that provides encapsulation for our web components, and then custom events. So this allows us to actually create those triggers for DOM interaction. My company has a training on web components here, so if you're like, oh, what are these web components? There's a link available there. So Angular elements, again, are just Angular components packaged as custom elements or web components. So I've got a couple great articles here listed on companies who've successfully used Angular elements to do a couple different approaches. Isn't Capital One based here? Yeah, okay, so they're a really good, sorry? Yes. I might do I have that linked? No, I have a couple different things linked here, but yeah, so cool success story right out of here from taking that approach. So if you're excited about some of this and you're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go and use all these modern tools, here's what you're not gonna do. You are not gonna run back to work and refactor your app over the weekend without the express consent of your team, okay? All on the same page? Like, this stuff is fun, it's shiny, it's new, it can let you write better code, but do not go Cowboy code this shit or I will hunt you down and scold you. Then you will be shamed. So, key concepts, we talked about refactoring our AngularJS apps to follow the AngularJS style guide, take advantage of some of those approaches, choosing a build process that makes sense for your team, whether you need to implement something because you don't have it already or you just need to integrate TypeScript compilation into your current build process. Talked about starting to rewrite some of our major files into TypeScript and taking a more modular approach to that. We talked about implementing RxJS where it makes sense. And considering building new features in Angular elements and doing nothing without buy-in from your team. Okay, that's all I have from you. This is the slide that you want to take a photo of. This has all the slides. This has the example app. And then if you are curious about this API, that's the link to it. So. Sorry that was kind of rushed at the end. I got a little too babble happy. I normally do this in like an hour, not 45 minutes. So that's all I have for you. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.